Hello, listeners, and greetings to you wherever you are in the universe, in time and space. Continuing now with a reading of Jurgen, a Comedy of Justice by James Branch Cabell, first published in 1919. And this is chapter 13, Philosophy of Grogravan Guar. At Camalizar, the young Duke of Logres spent most of his time in the company of Guinevere, whose father made no objection overtly. Grogravan had his promised talk with Jurgen. I lament that Dame Yolande dealt over thriftily with you, the king said, first of all, for I estimated you two would be a spark and tinder, kindling between you an amorous conflagration to burn up all this nonsense about my daughter. Thrift, sir, said Jurgen discreetly, is a proverbial virtue, and fires may not consume true love. That is the truth, Grogravan admitted. Whoever says it. And he sighed. Then for a while he sat in nodding meditation. Tonight the old king wore a disreputably rusty gown of black stuff with fur about the neck and sleeves of it, and his scant white hair was covered by a very shabby black cap. So he huddled over a small fire in a large stone fireplace carved with shields. Beside him was white wine and red, which stayed untasted until Grogravan meditated upon things that fretted him. Now then, says Grogravan Guar, this marriage with the High King of the Britons must go forward, of course. That was settled last year when Arthur and his devil-mongers, the Lady of the Lake and Merlin Ambrosius, were at some pains to rescue me at Carahes. I estimate that Arthur's ambassadors, probably the devil-mongers themselves, will come for my daughter before June is out. Meanwhile, you two have youth and love for playthings, and it is spring. What is the season of the year to me, groaned Jurgen, when I reflect that within a week or so the lady of my heart will be borne away from me forever? How can I be happy when all the while I know the long years of misery and vain regret are near at hand? You are saying that, observed the king, in part because you drank too much last night, and in part because you think it is expected of you. For in point of fact, you are as happy as anyone is permitted to be in this world, through the simple reason that you are young. Misery, as you employ the word, I consider to be a poetical trope. But I can assure you that the moment you are no longer young, the years of vain regret will begin either way. That is true, said Jurgen heartily. How do you know? Now then, put it, I were insane enough to marry my daughter to a mere duke. You would grow damnably tired of her. I can assure you of that. Also, for in disposition, Guinevere is her sainted mother all over again. She is nice looking, of course, because in that she takes after my side of the family. But between ourselves, she is not particularly intelligent, and she will always be making eyes at some man or another. Today it appears to be your turn to serve as her target, in a fine, glittering shirt of which the like was never seen in Galatheon. I deplore, but even as I cannot deny your rights as the champion who rescued her, and I must bid you make the most of that turn. Meanwhile, it occurs to me, sir, that it is unusual to betroth your daughter to one man and permit her to go freely with another. If you insist upon it, said Grogravan Guar, I can't, of course, lock up the pair of you in separate dungeons until the wedding day. Meanwhile, it occurs to me you should be the last commentator to grumble. Why, I tell you plainly, sir, that critical persons would say you are taking very small care of your daughter's honor. To that there are several answers, replied the king. One is that I remember my late wife as tenderly as possible, and I reflect I have only her word for it as to Guinevere's being my daughter. Another is that, though my daughter is a quiet and well-conducted young woman, I never heard King Thragnar was anything of this sort. Oh, sir, said Jurgen, horrified, whatever are you hinting? All sorts of things, however, happen in caves, things which it is wiser to ignore in sunlight. So I ignore. I ask no questions. My business is to marry my daughter acceptably, and that only. Such discoveries as may be made by her husband afterward are his affair, not mine. This much I might tell you, Monsieur de Langres, by way of answer. But the real answer is to bid you consider this, that a woman's honor is concerned with one thing only, and it is a thing with which the honor of a man is not concerned at all. But now you talk in riddles, King, and I wonder what it is you would have me do. Groggervan grinned. Obviously, I advise you to give thanks you were born a man, because that sturdier sex has so much less need to bother over breakage. What sort of breakage, sir? Said Jurgen. Groggerman told him. Duke Jurgen, for the second time, looked properly horrified. Your aphorisms, King, are abominable, and of a sort unlikely to quiet my misery. However, we were speaking of your daughter, and it is she who must be considered, rather than I. Now I perceive that you take my meaning perfectly. Yes, in all matters which concern my daughter, I would have you lie like a gentleman. Well, I am afraid, sir, said Jurgen, after a pause, that you are a person of somewhat degraded ideals. Ah, but you are young. Youth can afford ideals, being vigorous enough to stand the hard knocks they earn their possessor. But I am an old fellow, cursed with a tender heart and tolerably keen eyes. That combination, Monsieur de Langres, is one which very often forces me to jeer out of season, simply because I know myself to be on the verge of far more untimely tears. Thus Groggerman replied. He was silent for a while, and he contemplated the fire. Then he waved shriveled hand toward the window, and Groggerman began to speak meditatively. Monsieur de Langres, it is night in my city of Camillard, and somewhere one of those roads harbors a girl whom we will call Lynette. She has a lover. We will say he is called Sagramore. The names do not matter. Tonight, as I speak with you, Lynette lies motionless in the carved wide bed that formerly was her mother's. She is thinking of Sagramore. The room is dark, save where moonlight silvers the diamond-shaped panes of ancient windows. In every corner of the room, mysterious, quivering suggestions lurk. Ah, sire, says Jurgen, you also are a poet. Do not interrupt me, then. Lynette, I repeat, is thinking of Sagramore. Again they sit near the lake, under an apple tree older than Rome. The knotted branches of the tree are unpraised as in benediction. And petals fluttering, drifting, turning, interminably white petals fall silently in the stillness. Neither speaks, for there is no need. Silently he brushes a petal from the blackness of her hair, and silently he kisses her. The lake is dusky and hard seeming as jade. Two lonely stars hang low in the green sky. It is droll that the chest of a man is hairy, oh, very droll. And a bird is singing. A silvery needle of sound moves fitfully in the stillness. Surely high heaven is thus quietly colored and thus strangely lovely. So at least thinks little Lynette, lying motionless like a little mouse in the carved wide bed wherein Lynette was born. A very moving touch that, Jurgen interpolated. Now there is another sort of singing, for now the pothouse closes. Big shutters bang, feet shuffle, a drunken man hiccups in his singing. It is a love song he is murdering. He sheds inexplicable tears as he lurches nearer and nearer to Lynette's window, and his heart is all magnanimity, for Sagramore is celebrating his latest conquest. Do you not think that this or something very like this is happening tonight in my city of Camelard, Monsieur de Langres? It happens momently, said Jurgen, everywhere. For thus is every woman for a little while, and thus is every man for all time. That being a dreadful truth, continued Grogravan, you may take it as one of the many reasons why I jeer out of season in order to stave off far more untimely tears. For this thing happens, in my city it happens, and in my castle it happens. King or no, I am powerless to prevent its happening, so I can but shrug and hearten my old blood with a fresh bottle. No less, I regard the young woman, who is quite possibly my daughter, with considerable affection. And it would be salutary for you to remember that circumstance, Monsieur de Langres, if ever you are tempted to be candid. Jurgen was horrified. But with the princess, sir, it is unthinkable that I should not deal fairly. King Grogravan continued to look at Jurgen. Grogravan Guar said nothing, and not a muscle of him moved. Although, of course, said Jurgen, I would, in simple justice to her, not ever consider volunteering any information likely to cause pain. Again I perceive, said Grogravan, that you understand me. Yet I did not speak of my daughter only, but of everybody. How then, sir, would you have me deal with everybody? Why, I can but repeat my words, said Grogravan, very patiently. I would have you lie like a gentleman. And now be off with you, for I am going to sleep. I shall not be wide awake again until my daughter is safely married, and that is absolutely all I can do for you. Do you think this is a reputable conduct, King? Oh no, says Grogravan, surprised. It is what we call philanthrope. Chapter 14, Preliminary Tactics of Duke Jurgen. So Jurgen abode at court and was tolerably content for a little while. He loved a princess, the fairest and most perfect of mortal women, and loved her, a circumstance to which he frequently recurred, as never any other man had loved in the world's history. And very shortly he was to stand by and see her married to another. Here was a situation to delight the chivalrous court of Galthion, for every requirement of romance was exactly fulfilled. Now the appearance of Guinevere, whom Jurgen loved with an entire heart, was this. She was of middling height, with a figure not yet wholly the figure of a woman. She had fine and very thick hair, and the color of it was yellow of corn floss. When Guinevere undid her hair, it was a marvel to Jurgen to note how snugly this hair descended about the small head and slender throat, and then broadened boldly and clothed her with a loose soft foam of pallid gold. For Jurgen delighted in her hair, and with increasing intimacy loved to draw great strands of it back of his head, crossing them there and pressing soft handfuls of her perfumed hair against his cheeks as he kissed the princess. The head of Guinevere, be it repeated, was small. You wondered at the proud, free, tossing movements of that little head, which had to sustain the weight of so much hair. The face of Guinevere was colored tenderly and softly. It made the faces of other women seem the work of a sign painter, just splotched in anyhow. Gray eyes had Guinevere, veiled but incredibly long black lashes that curved incredibly. Her brows arched rather high above her eyes. That was almost a fault. Her nose was delicate and saucy. Her chin was impudence made flesh, and her mouth was a tiny and irresistible temptation. And so on and so on. But indeed, there is no sense at all in describing this lovely girl as though I was taking an inventory of my shop window, said Jurgen. Analogues are all very well, and they have the unanswerable sanction of custom. Nonetheless, when I proclaim that my adored mistress's hair reminds me of gold, I am quite consciously lying. It looks like yellow hair and nothing else, nor would I willingly venture within 10 feet of any woman whose head sprouted with wires of whatever metal. And to protest that her eyes are as gray and fathomless as the sea is very well also, and the sort of thing which seems expected of me. But imagine how horrific would be puddles of water slopping about in a lady's eye sockets. If we poets could actually behold the monsters we rhyme of, we would scream and run. Still, I rather liked this Cervantes, for he was making a servante in praise of Guinevere. It was the pleasant custom of Gorgon's court that every gentleman must compose verses in honor of the lady of whom he was hopelessly enamored, as well as that in these verses he should address the lady as one whose name was too sacred to mention. Otherwise than did her sponsors. So Duke Jurgen de Langre duly rhapsodized of his Philida. I borrow for my dear love the appellation of that noted but by much inferior lady who was beloved by Ariphus of Balside, he explained. You will remember, Pulliger suspects she was a princess of the house of Scholvrens, and you of course recall Pisander's masterly summing up of the probabilities in his Hercule. Oh yes, they said, and the courtiers of Gorgavangoire, like Mother Serrato, were greatly impressed by young Jurgen's erudition. For Jurgen was Duke of Langres nowadays, with his glittering shirt and the coronet upon his bridle to show for it. Awkwardly, this proved to be an earl's coronet, but incongruities are not always inexplicable. It was Earl Garamond's horse. You have doubtless heard of Garamond, but to ask that is insulting. Oh, not at all. It is humor. We perfectly understand your humor, Duke Jurgen. And a very pretty fighter I found this famous Garmund as I traveled westward, and since he killed my steed in the heat of our conversation, I was compelled to take over his horse after I'd given this poor Garmund proper interment. Oh yes, a very pretty fighter, and I had heard much talk of him in Longray. He was Lord of Orc and Persal, you remember, though of course the estate came by his mother's side. Oh yes, they said, you must not think that we of Galtheon are quite shut out from the great world. We have heard of all these affairs, and we have also heard fine things of your Duchy of Longres, monsieur. Doubtless, said Jurgen, and turned again to his singing. Lo, for I pray to thee, resistless love, he descanted, that thou today make cry unto my love, to Phillida, whom I, poor Logre, love so tenderly, not to dear me love, not to deny me love. Asked why, say thou my drink and food is love? In days wherein I think and brood on love, and truly find not good in aught save love, since Phillida hath taught me how to love. Here Jurgen groaned with nicely modulated ardor, and he continued, if she avows such constant hate of love as would ignore my great and constant love, plead thou no more. With listless love of love woo death restlessly, resistless love. In place of her that saith such, scorn of love as leads to death, the lure and grace I love. Thus Jurgen sang melodiously of his Phillida, and meant thereby, as everybody knew, the Princess Guinevere. Since custom compelled him to deal in analogues, he dealt wholesale. In gems and metals, the blossoms of the field and garden, fires and wounds, and sunrises and perfumes, his armory of lethal weapons, ice, an armory of lethal weapons, ice, and a concourse of mythological deities were his starting point. Then the seas and heavens were dredged of phenomena, to be mentioned with disparagement in comparison with one or another feature of Duke Jurgen's Phillida. Zoology and history, and generally the remembered contents of his pawn shop were overhauled and made to furnish targets for depreciation. Whereas in dealing with the famous ladies loved by earlier poets, Duke Jurgen was positively insulting, allowing hardly a rag of merit. Still, he was careful to be just, and he allowed that these poor creatures might figure advantageously enough in eyes which had never beheld his Phillida. And to all this information the lady whom he hymned attended willingly. She is a princess, reflected Jurgen. She is quite beautiful. She is young, and whatever her father's opinion, she is reasonably intelligent as women go. Nobody could ask more. Why then am I not out of my head about her? Already she permits a kiss or two when nobody is around, and presently she will permit more, and she thinks I am quite the cleverest person living. Come, Jurgen, man, is there no heart in this spry young body you have regained? Come, let us have a little honest rapture and excitement over this promising situation. But somehow Jurgen could not manage it. He was interested in what he knew was going to happen. Yes, undoubtedly he looked forward to more intimate converse with this beautiful young princess. but it was rather as one anticipates partaking of a favorite dessert. Jurgen felt that a liaison arranged for in this spirit was neither one thing nor the other. If only I could feel like a cold-blooded villain now, I would at worst be classifiable. But I intend the girl no harm. I am honestly fond of her. I shall talk my best, broaden her ideas, and give her, I flatter myself, considerable pleasure. Vulgar prejudices apart, I shall leave her no whit the worse. Why, the dear little thing, not for the ransom of 7 emperors would I do her any hurt. And in these matters discretion is everything, simply everything. No, quite decidedly I am not a cold-blooded villain, and I shall deal fairly with the princess. Thus Jurgen was disappointed by his own emotions, as he turned them from side to side and prodded them, and shifted to a fresh viewpoint, only to find it no more favorable than the one relinquished. But he veiled the inadequacy of his emotions with very moving fervors. The tale does not record his conversations with Guinevere, for Jurgen now discoursed plain idiocy, as one purveys sweetmeats to a child in fond astonishment at the pet's appetite. And leisurely Jurgen advanced. There was no hurry, with weeks wherein to accomplish everything. Meanwhile, this routine work had a familiar pleasantness. For the amateur coordinates matters, knowing that one thing axiomatically leads to another. There is no harm at all in respectful allusions to a love that comprehends its hopelessness. It was merely a fact which Jurgen mentioned and was about to pass on. Only Guinevere, in modesty, was forced to disparage her own attractions as an inadequate cause for so much misery. Common courtesy demanded that Jurgen enter upon a rebuttal. To emphasize one point in this, the orator was forced to take the hand of his audience. But strangers did that every day, with nobody objecting. Moreover, the hand was here not so much seized as displayed by its detainer, as evidence of what he contended. How else was he to prove the Princess of Galtheon had the loveliest hand in the world? It was not a matter he could request Guinevere to accept on hearsay, and Jurgen wanted to deal fairly with her. Well, but before relinquishing the loveliest hand in the world, a connoisseur will naturally kiss each fingertip. This is merely a tribute to perfection and has no personal application. Besides, a kiss, wherever deposited, as Jurgen pointed out, is when you think of it, but a ceremonial of no intrinsic wrongfulness, The girl demurring against this apothegm, as custom again exacted, was still in common fairness convinced of her error. So now, says Jurgen presently, you see for yourself. Is anything changed between us? Do you not sit here just as we were before? Why, to be sure, a kiss is now attestedly a quiet, innocuous performance, with nothing very fearful about it one way or the other. It even has its pleasant side. Thus there is no need to make a pother over kisses or over an arm about you when it is more comfortable sitting so. How can one reasonably deny to a sincere friend what is accorded to a cousin or an old cloak? It would be nonsense, as Jurgen demonstrated, with a very apt citation from Napuscus. Then sitting so in the heat of conversation, a speaker naturally gesticulates, and a deal of his eloquence is dependent upon his hands. When anyone is talking, it is discourteous to interrupt, whereas to lay hold of a gentleman's hand outright, as Jurgen parentheses, is a little forward. No, he really did not think it would be quite proper for Guinevere to hold his hand. Let us preserve decorum, even in trifles. Ah, but you know that you are doing wrong. I doing wrong? I, who am simply sitting here and talking my poor best in an effort to entertain you? Come now, princess, but tell me what you mean. You should know very well what I mean. But I protest to you, I have not the least notion. How can I possibly know what you mean when you refuse to tell me what you mean? And since the princess declined to put into words just what she meant, things stayed as they were for the while. Thus did Jurgen coordinate matters, knowing that one thing axiomatically leads to another, and in short, affairs sped very much as Jurgen had anticipated. Now, by ordinary, Jurgen talked with Guinevere in dimly lighted places. He preferred this because then he was not bothered by that unaccountable shadow whose presence in sunlight put him out. Nobody ever seemed to notice this preposterous shadow. It was patent, indeed, that nobody could see it save Jurgen. Nonetheless, the thing worried him. So even from the first he remembered Guinevere as a soft voice and a delectable perfume in twilight, as a beauty not clearly visioned. And Groggervan's people worried him. The hook-nosed, tall old king had been by Jurgen dismissed from thought, as an enigma not important enough to be worth the trouble of solving. Groggervan at once seemed to be schooling himself to patience under some private annoyance, and to be revolving in his mind some private jest. He was queer, and probably abominable, but to grant the old rascal his due, he was not meddlesome. The people about Groggervan, though, were perplexing. These men who considered that all you possessed was loaned you to devote to the service of your God, your king, and every woman who crossed your path, could hardly be behaving rationally. To talk of serving God sounded as sonorously and as inspiritingly as a drum. Yes, and a drum had nothing but air in it. The priests said so-and-so, but did anybody believe the gallant Bishop of Marion, for example, was anything to be depended upon? I would like the opinion of Prince Everock's wife as to that, said Jurgen, with a grin, for it was well known that all affairs between the Dame Alundian and the bishop were so discreetly managed as to afford no reason for any scandal whatever. As for serving the king, there in plain view was Groggervan Gwar for anyone who so elected to regard and grow enthusiastic over. Groggervan might be shrewd enough, but to Jurgen he suggested very little of the Lord's anointed. To the contrary, he reminded you of Jurgen's brother-in-law, the grocer, without being graced by the tradesman's friendly interest in customers. Groggervan Gwar was a person whom Jurgen simply could not imagine any intelligent deity selecting a steward. And finally, when it came to serving women, what sort of service did women most cordially appreciate? Jurgen had his answer pat enough, but it was an answer not suitable for utterance in mixed company. No one of my honest opinions, in fact, is adapted to further my popularity in Galtheon, because I am a monstrous clever fellow who does justice to things as they are. Therefore I must remember always, in justice to myself, that I very probably hold traffic with madmen. Yet Rome was a fine town, and it was geese who saved it. These people may be right, and I cannot go so far as to say they are wrong, but still at the same time, yes, that is how I feel about it. Thus did Jurgen abide at the chivalrous court of Galtheon, and conform to all its customs. In the matter of love songs, nobody protested more movingly that the lady whom he loved, quite hopelessly of course, embodied all divine perfections. And when it came to knightly service, the possession of Caliburn made the dispatching of thieves and giants and dragons seem hardly sportsmanlike. Still, Jurgen fought a little now and then in order to conform to the customs of Galtheon, and the Duke of Langres was widely praised as a very promising young knight. And all the while he fretted because he could just dimly perceive that ideal which was served in Galtheon, and the beauty of this ideal, but could not possibly believe in it. Here was again a loveliness perceived in twilight, a beauty not clearly visioned. Yet am not I a monstrous clever fellow, he would console himself, to take them all and so completely? It is a joke to which I think I do full justice. So Jurgen abode among these persons to whom life was a high-hearted journeying homeward. God the Father awaited you there, ready to punish at need, but eager to forgive after the manner of all fathers. That one became a little soiled in traveling and sometimes blundered into the wrong lane was a matter which fathers understood. Meanwhile, here was an ever-present reminder of his perfection, incarnated in women, the finest and the noblest of his creations. Thus was every woman a symbol to be honored magnanimously and reverently, so said they all. Why, but to be sure, assented Jurgen, and in support of his position he very edifyingly quoted Ophelion and Fabinus Papirius and Sextius Niger to boot. Okay, drink a whole bunch of water. I'll be back to read more before too long. Thanks very much for listening. This reading is being archived on YouTube. Roarshock channel, Roarshock channel. Go there, find me, subscribe, please. And thanks for listening. I appreciate you listening. Thanks very much.